In tonight's Dateline Defense, Venezuela's economic crisis. For months, the South American country has been on the brink of bankruptcy, and with the latest drop in global markets, things are getting worse. Now the nation has turned to China for support. Joining me tonight with the latest is J.D. Gordon, a retired Navy commander and former Defense Department spokesman. He's now executive director of Protect America Today. J.D., the Chinese government has announced it will loan Venezuela $5 billion to boost oil output in the country to help with its economy. Currently, China receives 700,000 barrels of oil from the South American nation per day. Now, with oil prices already so low, will the economic situation for Venezuela get worse before it gets better?
Hi, Morris. Good to see you. Yes, I think it will. Citi Research estimates that Venezuela needs oil to be about $150 a barrel in order to break even. Well, today it's only about $50 a barrel, and last week it was even lower. So Venezuela is continuing to hemorrhage, and it's not just about oil, though, Morris. It's about policies, because Venezuela has these socialist policies where they tried to make everyone equal, but they really just made everybody poor, because what they did is the Venezuelan government under Hugo Chavez initially had price controls over goods. So if you were poor, it was good because you could buy things cheaply. However, if you owned a business, like say in the cattle industry or dairy industry, you couldn't make any money, so then you just quit. And so that's why you have a lot of food shortages in Venezuela, bread lines like the old Soviet Union, even lack of toilet paper, toothpaste, things like that, because businesses just can't make a profit, so they just go out of business. Now, so anyway, that's a problem.
And petroleum accounts for 95% of Venezuela's exports and more than 50% of its GDP. That puts the country on very shaky ground, J.D., especially with low oil prices that we all know about. Are there other economic alternatives for Venezuela and other countries like it?
Well, yeah, I mean, they have to enact policies that create jobs and don't punish the private sector.
Right.
But they have to get off of dependence on oil, too, as far as their lifeblood of the economy. Just like all countries that are exporting oil, as far as the major ones, Morris, if you look at some of the major ones, they end up being very aggressive, like Russia, Iran, are some of the world's most aggressive countries, because if you could just pump oil out of the ground, it doesn't take much initiative or much effort, but you could be as aggressive as you can be, because countries need that oil. So I think it's a wake-up call for Venezuela. They need to enact different kind of policies.
It shows what happens to any nation, particularly Russia, when your whole country is basically based on one commodity. You're just one giant gas station with these low prices. We know what can happen. Let's get back to China, J.D. This week, they celebrated the 70th anniversary of Japan's surrender during World War II. China kicked off the festivities with a massive parade highlighting the nation's armed forces, but now China's president has just announced he's reducing military personnel by 300,000. What's going on?
Well, I think China is trying to trim their military down. It's 2.3 million, and their personnel costs are rising. So just like we see here, the military is being trimmed down because personnel costs are high to make room for more spending on technology. China's got that same issue. But long term, I think China wants to be the world's next superpower. I think that's why they're attacking the U.S. With this espionage, cyber attacks continuously, and also they're constructing sandbars from some of the disputed islands in the Spratly Island groups, because they want to claim that as their territory. So I think China's becoming increasingly aggressive, and they're trying to knock us off as the world superpower eventually.
So you don't see this reduction as their way of offering us an olive branch?
No, not at all. I think it's all about them. We've got to remember, communist China is still a dictatorship. So even though they've liberalized the economy and they hold over $1 trillion in U.S. debt, they're still very much a rival.
Now, later this month, J.D., the Chinese president will visit the White House in hopes of easing tensions. Everything from cybersecurity to the economy will be discussed. What do you think will come from the meeting?
Well, I think that the president will talk about the need for China to stop attacking us. The White House has been talking about enacting a sanctions package against China, which is long overdue, because China keeps hacking into our industry and our military and doing as much as they can to throw us off balance. So I think they'll talk about the cyber attacks and also climate change. The president has been pretty vocal about that. The Chinese have said they'll work on climate change too, but unfortunately not for a couple decades. So we can't really allow that. I mean, if we're going to be pushing climate change on our industries here, China's got to get tough on their climate right now.
I mean, the air is so thick you can cut it with a knife in that country.
Right. That's absolutely right. Yeah, China is an ecological disaster right now, so they've got to come around.
All right, before you go, I'd like your take on the massive migrant crisis happening in Europe. Refugees from the war-torn Middle East are flocking to the UK, Germany, and Hungary, putting an immense burden on the governments there. Yet the wealthier Gulf states like Saudi Arabia haven't stepped up to the task. Instead, they say a visa is necessary to enter, but they're very expensive. Why aren't the Gulf states doing more?
Well, the Gulf states look after number one, and that's themselves. Europe, a lot of times, especially Western Europe, really don't. If you look at countries like Germany and France, basically they want to take in all the migrants possible. Germany's got 800,000 that came this year alone. That's unsustainable. That's about 1% of their population. So that's unsustainable. Unfortunately, Morris, I lived in Europe for a couple of years, and I spoke at a couple European Parliament events in the last few. And I think in Europe, especially Western Europe, you see a collective guilt for colonialism, and in Germany for Nazism as well.
It is that guilt continues, you're right, so they don't want to turn people away. But you'd think Saudi Arabia, I mean, come on. You've got these wealthy Gulf states, they're not doing anything.
We ought to be pressuring Saudi Arabia to do more. So should the Europeans. But the Europeans, unfortunately, some countries have a suicidal policy for immigration, and Germany and France are trying to push it on all of the EU, 28 countries. That could break up the EU.
Yeah.
There's going to be pendulum swings because people are sick and tired of seeing on what's going on, and not everybody is guilty about colonialism or Nazism there.
Right. All right.
So it's a big problem.
It's a shame to see what's going on. J.D. Gordon, Executive Director, Protect America Today. Thanks again, J.D.
Thanks so much, Morris.